Good afternoon, or good evening, or good night, or good morning to all of you. I'm Paul Coleman, Theology Department here at the University of Notre Dame in the World Religions, World Church program. It's been my pleasure to help plan this conference with my colleague and friend, Professor Gabriel Reynolds. The third of, and what we hope will be a long series of conferences that's sponsored by our area in the Department of Theology, World Religions, and World Church. This is the sixth, I think, or seventh Friday in which we've been gathering. So I'm really grateful to all of you for participating today, and a special gratitude for those who've been able to participate in past events on our Friday afternoons, at least here in Notre Dame, they're Friday afternoons when we've been able to hear a series of papers. Today we have three papers that will discuss sanctity in a comparative perspective with a focus on China. We have papers by Professor Rob Gimello, Professor Xueying Wang, and Professor Zhang. And I apologize in advance for mispronouncing their names if my lack of Chinese facility does so, but I am grateful to all three of them on behalf of Gabriel and the rest for preparing their papers, and we look forward to hearing from them. Just a reminder, we would invite each of them to speak for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have 5 to 10 minutes of discussion and questions. Meanwhile, I invite you to mute your microphone while they make their presentations in case background noise would sneak in. So let me first begin by introducing Professor Rob Gimello. Professor Gimello is a historian of Buddhism with a special interest in theology of religions and comparative mysticism. He taught at the University of Notre Dame for a number of years after coming to us from Harvard University. He was a very valued colleague in the World Religions, World Church area, and we're still grateful, very grateful for the fact that he participates regularly in our colloquia and other events that our area seeks to organize. Professor Gimello is now a professor emeritus at the University of Notre Dame, and so what he does now is all merit, we might say. So that increases his sanctity, and we are grateful. I'm going to be sharing with the rest of you, hopefully, his PowerPoint, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Gimello.
You should have my email now.
Is it there?
Yes, it is.
Great. Go right ahead, and tell me when I should advance.
So you have to advance it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, you can go to the next screen.
Great.
My focus today is on a particular figure in the early history of Chinese Buddhism, a monk named Jietuo, about whom I'll tell you a bit more later. But before approaching him as a model of sanctity as it was understood in the East Asian Buddhist tradition, I wanted to introduce you, as I think might be necessary for folks in the conference who are not familiar with Buddhism, introduce you to some of the general themes of personal sanctity or sainthood in the Buddhist tradition at large. And I'll begin with what might be called the theory of sainthood in the Buddhist tradition. You see on the screen before you explanation that the Buddhists recognize two orders of human sentient beings, particularly in the early Buddhist tradition. One kind of sentient being is known simply as a pratyajna, an ordinary person, or a commoner, spiritual commoner. That is a person who is not on the path, the marga, to liberation, who is mired in suffering, and who is destined to be repeatedly reborn unless and until embarked on the path. You might say that this is distantly analogous to the notion of sinner in Christianity, but without the connotations of wickedness or alienation from God. The other category of sentient beings is that of the noble being, the Arya, or in Chinese, Sheng, that is a person who has embarked on the multi-stage path to liberation. The transition from ordinary to noble status is understood in Buddhism to be a kind of fundamental ontological change, or radical metanoia, if you will, by which one becomes a fundamentally different and, of course, superior kind of sentient being. The term Zheng that is used to translate the Sanskrit word Arya is the same word used in Confucianism and Taoism, as many of you will know, to label what was commonly called in English a sage, that is a being of transcendent, virtually divine wisdom, like the ancient mythic emperors Yao and Shun, and like such historical figures as Confucius and Lao Tzu. And it's interesting to note that in the Chinese Christian tradition, this same word Zheng is commonly used to translate such terms as hagios, sanctus, saint. When used as an adjective, it means sacred or holy. Thus, the standard Chinese Christian translation of the word Bible is Shengjing, literally holy classic. Next slide, please. There are understood to be grades of sanctity or levels of Arya status, levels of sainthood, which Buddhists understand as stages on the path to liberation. This is true in early Buddhism, especially. Movement through these stages is commonly understood to require multiple lifetimes of moral, intellectual, and contemplative practice. The first such stage is that of what is called the stream winner, one who has entered the path and undergone the ontological change from ordinary to noble person. That's followed by the once returner, who is one who has attained a penultimate birth or rebirth or lifetime. That's followed by the stage of the non-returner, the one who has been reborn into a final lifetime. And finally, there is the culminating stage, the ultimate stage of the arhat, the one who has achieved nirvana, that is full and final liberation from the cycle of birth and suffering known as samsara. Next stage. Next slide, please. Sainthood, or Arya status in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, Mahayana arose early in the Common Era, and with it arose a new ideal of perfection or of sainthood, that of the Bodhisattva. Whereas arhatship, earlier thought to be the pinnacle of the path, was understood to be the achievement of one's final liberation from suffering and rebirth. The Mahayanist aspires to become not an arhat, but a Buddha. Such an aspirant, the Bodhisattva, is stirred by an impulse of universal compassion and seeks not self-liberation, but the liberation of all sentient beings. And rather than exit samsara by attaining his own nirvana, he remains in samsara, working on behalf of suffering beings and manifesting himself to them in many times and places and in various forms as incarnations, apparitions, visionary experiences, etc. Like early Buddhism, which Mahayana characterized as Hinayana, the small vehicle, Mahayana describes its version of the path, known simply as the Bodhisattva path, as consisting in a series of stages, bhumi as they're called in Sanskrit, classically 10 of them, through which one progresses by practicing 10 virtues or perfections: the perfection of insight or wisdom, the perfection of meditative concentration, and so forth. Next stage, please. But when we move from the realm of the theory of sainthood in Buddhism into sainthood as a category in Buddhist history or biography or hagiography, we enter different territory entirely. Next slide. The sources we use for the life stories of those who might be called saints in the East Asian tradition are collections of hagiographies known as hagiographies of eminent monks. And those collections of hagiographies are organized according to certain categories of sanctity, which I've listed here from one of the early such collections. And we'll give you some idea of how sainthood is divided into its subcategories in Buddhism. There are translators who are regarded as galsang, eminent monks, or Buddhist saints, if you will. There are those who have achieved eminence or saintly status by virtue of their work as exegetes, interpreters of scripture. There's another class of saintly monks who are theurgists or miracle workers. Then there are those who are eminent by virtue of their attainments as meditators or contemplatives. There are also experts or models of experts in or models of excellence in monastic discipline. There's a group called self-immolators, people who kill themselves, usually by incineration. And this is the closest Buddhist analog to the martyrs of Christianity and Islam. You may recall, if you remember or have read about the Vietnam War, that there were monks who immolated themselves, and they belonged to that class. Final three, the cantors, those who are famous for their achievements as people who intone or chant the scriptures. Promoters of merit, those who are famous for raising funds on behalf of Buddhist institutions and for dispensing charity on behalf of Buddhist institutions, those who need it. And finally, there are hymnists, composers of liturgical music. This gives you some idea of the categories of sanctity recognized in the Buddhist tradition. Next slide, please. Another kind of Mahayana Buddhist sainthood, not formally recognized as a category in the hagiographical canons, but of great importance in the actual practice of Buddhism, was that of the manifestation body, the Nirmanakaya, or Huashan, the incarnation of a great or celestial bodhisattva. One of the paramount bodhisattvas in the Mahayana tradition, the Mahayana pantheon, who is often dubbed the king of bodhisattvas, was a figure known as Manjushri, or Wanchupusa in Chinese. And you see here, I hope you see clearly, images of that particular bodhisattva, who is found throughout the Buddhist world. The one on the left is from Java, and the other two are for different parts of China. He's a very important figure in connection with the particular Buddhist saint whom I'm going to discuss. Next slide, please. Manjushri is especially famous and beloved in the East Asian tradition, most especially in China, because he is said to live in China. He has a terrestrial residence, which Chinese locate in northern Shanxi province in a collection of mountains known as Wutaishan, the Five Terrace Mountains. And you see both a couple of pictures, one a painting, the other a photograph of the Wutaishan area. And this is a famous pilgrimage site in the Buddhist world, not only in China or East Asia. People came from all over the Buddhist world to Wutaishan in the hopes of encountering in one way or another the Bodhisattva Manjushri. You see an image of pilgrims from a medieval painting at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. Buddhism's magic mountain, you might call Wutaishan, the scene of countless miraculous events thought to be precipitated by Manjushri's presence there. And you have two early depictions of Wutaishan, a 10th century Chinese painting and a Tibetan painting. Wutaishan was famous, important to Tibetan Buddhism as well as the rest of Buddhism. The great, here you see images, an image of Wutaishan against the background, the image of Manjushri against the background of Wutaishan, since he's thought to reside there. And Buddhist pilgrims to Wutai have hoped to have visions of Manjushri, or at least visions of certain characteristic visual tokens of his presence, like uncanny lights hovering atop the peaks, golden bridges in the sky, or most common, unusual multicolored clouds like the one I managed to photograph during one of my visits that I hope you see on the screen. Next screen, please. My particular focus, against the background of what I've introduced to you so far, is a monk who lived in the late 6th and early to mid 7th century, died in sometime between 650 and 656 at the age of 80. He's a famous meditation master, scholar, evangelist, visionary, miracle worker, and abbot of the Fogwang, or Buddha Radiance Monastery, located on the outskirts of Wutaishan. Also a monk whom later tradition regarded as an incarnation, a manifestation body or transformation body of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. He is also regarded as one of the progenitors of the Xueying, or flower garland school of East Asian Buddhism. Next slide, please. Here you see on the left a photograph of Foguangsi, the Buddha Radiance Monastery as it exists today. And on the right of the screen, you'll see from one of those early maps / paintings of Wu Tai Shan, a medieval depiction of the monastery. With that as background, I'd like to present to you some of the key features, and I think we're done with the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm not sure what that means. If I can come back on the screen myself, is there a possibility of doing that?
I've done it, Rob. You're present. Everyone can see you, and
Everybody
you can
can
see them.
me. I can't see myself, but I'll trust your words here. What I've done is studied and translated the biographical and hagiographical tradition of this monk, and I'd like to quote from elements of passages in his classical hagiography as soon as I pull up my other computer. Which I'm having trouble doing. Hold on. Okay. A biography or hagiography of this monk Jietuo, this sort of Buddhist hero of Wu Tai Shan, was composed a few decades after his lifetime by the man known as the third patriarch of the Xueying tradition, a monk named Fa Zhang. And let me quote a few brief passages from this and then talk about what I think are their significance. The opening of the biography: Shi Jietuo of the Xing family of Wu Tai in Dai Prefecture entered the Sangha at the age of 6, became a postulant at the age of 6. Unbounded in his resolve, he first sought instruction in contemplation and renunciation under meditation master Hui Chao. Especially gifted as a judge of human character, Hui Chao recognized Jietuo's refined talent and declared to the brethren, Jietuo's meditation practice is so surpassingly brilliant that none of you disciples can emulate him. He's not to be treated as one of the common lot by being assigned routine Sangha duties, monastic duties. It was not long before Tuo's insight into the utmost profundities had come to the verge of perfection. Skipping along here. Jietuo was especially famous for having created and promulgated a particular technique of meditation known as the Buddha Radiance meditation, the same title, the same term, Buddha Radiance, that is the name of his monastery. And this is a form of meditation we assume not unlike what you find in tantric or esoteric Buddhism, in which an actual image of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva is created in the mind's eye and used as a focus of meditative attention, in the course of which one enters into a kind of deep amount of unification with the deity in question. Let me see here. It says of him, after he had perfected this method of meditation, that he often traveled to the old temple of the great Buddha located north of the flower garland that lies to the southeast of the central terrace. This is the heartland of Wu Tai Shan. 2 or 3 times, he did succeed in having visions of the Bodhisattva of Manjushri. On the first such occasion, Manjushri disappeared as soon as Jietuo had made his prostrations. The next time, in a personally conferred admonition, the Bodhisattva Manjushri spoke to Jietuo, saying, "Why must you prostrate yourself before me? You should be ashamed of yourself. All that is necessary is awakened understanding." This seems to be a critique embedded in the monk's hagiography of external practices of relationship with the Bodhisattva, which are, by Manjushri's own statement to Jietuo are inferior to interior experiences emerging in meditation. Let's see. Tuo heeded the message. Let me quote a little more here. Jietuo heeded the message of the sage and accordingly searched within himself until he attained the realization of non-arising, which is a synonym for emptiness, a key concept in Mahayana Buddhism. At the same time, experiencing the bliss of the Dharma, the kind of transport that can occur in advanced practice of meditation. Thereafter, regretting his pursuit of a solitary or selfish good, rejecting the goal of Hinayana Buddhism, of the purely contemplative, self-absorbed life, he set his heart on universal salvation, prayed sincerely for the great enlightenment, and sought to realize the thought of great enlightenment, the aspiration for great enlightenment. Thereupon, in response, Buddhas appeared and spoke to him this verse: "Profound indeed is the truth of the Buddha's quiescence, vast eons of cultivation, and lo, it is achieved. If you could open and let this Dharma eye shine forth, all the Buddhas would rejoice." Tuo then addressed a question heavenward: the truth of quiescence, can it be spoken so as to be taught to others? The Buddhas then hid themselves away and by voice alone declared, "The wisdom of expedience is a lamp revealing both the mind and its objects, but the ultimately true Dharma, of that there is nothing at all to be seen." The implicit claim of this passage in the biography is that the pursuit of visions, which was the goal of most people who traveled to Wutaishan, they hoped to have visions of Manjushri. But the claim here in this passage, although Jietuo himself had visions, it's being suggested that the pursuit of visions can be a kind of craving, a Hinayana, a small vehicle like indulgence in selfishness, and thus an obstacle to compassion for all beings that's required of a Mahayana Buddhist. Once, the biography continues, once the provincial governor requested transmission of the fragrant precepts. There was a special layman's ordination ceremony performed in medieval Chinese Buddhism. When the ceremony was over and Tuo was preparing to head back east, the governor and the monk disciples accompanied him to the city's eastern gate. It was near sunset, and Jietuo feared that he would be unable to perform the usual evening service of burning incense and making offerings. He was abject with shame, but suddenly he heard a voice from above saying, "Think of your joined palms as flowers, your body as an offering, your good thoughts as true incense, and your incantations as the rising of the fragrant smoke. All the Buddhas will smell the aroma, and following the sound will cross over to you. If these and other such things are done conscientiously, there can finally be no suspicion of dereliction." He was an expert in and a very fastidious observer of Buddhist monastic regulations, and feared that by leaving the city at sunset, he would be unable to perform the required evening ceremonies. But the voice from heaven urges him to think of his interior experiences, body and mind, as the equivalent of the observance of precepts.
Excuse me, Rob.
Nearly done.
I just want to make sure you know your time is winding down, so you might want to come to a conclusion.
I'm going to go to a conclusion here. It'll take me another 2 minutes. Is that all right?
Great, perfect, thank you.
What emerges in this biography, from which I've selected only a few, I thought, crucial passages, is that there were two kinds of Buddhist sanctity, at least recognized in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition of East Asia. A number of scholars of Chinese Buddhists have observed that Chinese Buddhists sometimes harbored doubts about the genuineness or the efficacy of things like pilgrimage to Wutaishan or visionary encounters with Manjushri, etc. I suggest that such anti-visionary trends betray a deeper and more pervasive tension in Chinese Buddhism as a whole and in Chinese Buddhist understanding of sanctity. A distinction needs to be drawn between what I might call visionary Buddhism, the kinds of Buddhist belief and practice that interpret the scriptures of Mahayana Buddhism more or less literally and strive to encounter in experiences of the world beyond the self, the transcendent beings and supernatural domains described in those scriptures. The other sort I would call the Buddhism of introspection, which favors figurative or anagogical over literal readings of scriptures, emphasizes interiority in the practice of imageless or quietistic forms of meditation, etc. Of course, neither of these two categories is often found in pure or isolate form. They are what Max Weber called ideal types. But we see in the case of Jietuo a kind of living, vital tension between these two modes of sainthood or sanctity. The mode that emphasizes visionary experience, encounters with Manjushri, and the mode that we would describe as interiorly contemplative. And what is particularly fascinating about Jietuo, I would suggest, is the way in which his life story somehow combines in living tension these two modes of sainthood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. That's great. So thanks for that great presentation about this interesting figure in Buddhist history who seems iconic as a way into the revealing the tension between those two kinds of Buddhist sanctity that you identified. Welcome some questions or comments. Simply raise your hand or start talking if you don't have a screen available. I have one, Rob, maybe. The kind of opposition or tension you identify between these two forms of Buddhist sanctity seem to be operative in other forms in other spiritual traditions as well. And not only spiritual traditions, but even in one scholar's approach to religious practices more generally outside of sanctity. I'm thinking about, obviously, the cataphatic, apophatic distinction in Christian spirituality. And even in someone like J.Z. Smith's approach to different forms of religion, he distinguishes between what he calls the locative, religion that's located in a place that's image-filled, and the utopian, that sort of imagines a world beyond this one. I'm wondering if you think that the tension you discern in Buddhism has kind of analogs across other religious traditions, mindful of your own awareness of comparative theology and comparative approaches to mysticism. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there are cross-cultural categories in which the Buddhist case can fit comfortably. Besides Wilfred Cantwell Smith, my friend, the late Ninian Smart, is famous for having argued a distinction between what he called numinous religion and mystical religion. And that's another way of conceiving this same tension. It was a self-conscious tension within the Buddhist tradition, which might be somewhat distinctive. Buddhist practitioners and thinkers worried themselves and aloud about which kind of religious practice was most appropriate in their lives. So it wasn't a distinction that was created out of modern scholarly analysis of religion, but arose clearly and explicitly within the Buddhist tradition.
Thanks. Other questions? Trent.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for that wonderful paper. I have just a very basic question. Was Jietuo's experience of kind of meditating on his ordinary functions as ritual functions, was that formalized? Did it become a tradition associated with him that was then practiced?
There is a tradition called the Buddha radiance or Buddha light,
okay.
A meditation tradition. of which he is thought to be the creator. And it pops up over and over again in the later history of Chinese, Korean, Japanese Buddhism. Whether it's the forms we find in later Buddhist history are exactly the same thing,
All right.
Jietuo practiced and taught, we can't be sure.
All right.
But visualization, meditation, focusing on the light radiating from the person of the Buddha, and interiorizing that light and identifying thereby with the Buddha was an important tradition in the Xueying Buddhist tradition,
right.
which Jietuo was associated with, and throughout East Asian esoteric Buddhism. So he's regarded as a kind of patriarch of that tradition.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess, I mean, I guess I was just, my question was about the specifics of the seeing, say, one's thoughts as incense.
Yeah.
Was it then, did one, I guess, maybe to reframe my question, was he seen as an exemplar in this case, such that one would then follow after him and do the same meditation, such that his, you know, such that one would say, well, just like Jietuo, you should take your thought should be considered as incense rising to the Buddhas. Your walking should be taken as, you know.
I think it was, its effect was to give permission
Yeah,
to people to excuse themselves from the actual external practices when circumstances required such an excuse, and focus one's attention entirely interiorly.
yeah.
But this seldom led to any kind of antinomianism in which ritual practice and observance of monastic discipline and so forth was discarded. It
Right.
was only subordinated to the interior religious life.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think we're going to have to move. I'd invite people, if they have questions for Professor Gimello directly, to simply contact him via email. So thank you so much. I'm grateful. Our second talk today and our third will be addressing Chinese situations in which Chinese religiosity and Christianity interact. Our next speaker is Professor Wang from Loyola University of Chicago. Professor Wang is a graduate of our PhD program in history of Christianity here at Notre Dame, and I had the blessing to interview her when she was applying about 15 years ago, and it was a very memorable moment, and we're really glad that you can join us. Professor Wang teaches at Loyola in the theology department, and her talk today is entitled Chinese Literati on Ancestral Rites in the Chinese Rites Controversy, the Example of Yanmo. So, Professor Wang, most welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Should I just share screen? Would that...
Perfect.
Okay, let's see.
Great.
Okay. Present here. Okay. All right. So a few weeks ago, Professor Odozer discussed whether ancestors should be venerated as saints in Africa. And today I'll take this topic to a different continent and discuss mostly two questions. One, should ancestors be venerated as saints in East Asia, especially in China, where ancestral sacrifices have been practiced for more than 2,000 years? And if not, what roles should ancestors then play in the life of Chinese Catholics? The veneration of ancestors in China under the influence of Confucianism has always been highly ritualized. In the context of inculturation of Christianity in Asia, some modern scholars have called for including ancestral rites in the liturgy of the Catholic Church. I cite Peter Phan as an example. Phan writes, quote, given the undeniably religious nature of ancestral worship, its liturgical inculturation can no longer be legitimated on the basis of its alleged merely civil and political character. Such a view, while making things easier for theologians and liturgists, empties the rituals of ancestral veneration of their deepest meanings and transformative power. Rather, with its religious nature frankly recognized, it is possible to appeal to the doctrine of a communion of saints and enlarge it in such a way that the ancestors can find their appropriate place in this communion and receive veneration. Phan draws his conclusion based on his study of the Chinese rites controversy, which, according to Phan, affirms that the Chinese who perform ancestral rites believe in the survival and real presence of ancestors in the name tablets, and that they attribute supernatural powers to their ancestors. Thus, ancestral veneration should be called ancestral worship or ancestral cult. Phan's assessment of ancestral rites echoes that of the Dominican missionaries during the time of the rites controversy in the 17th and 18th century, except that the solution the Dominicans offered based on this assessment is the opposite. The Dominicans called for banning ancestral rites among Chinese Catholics, whereas Phan is advocating acceptance of their religious nature and veneration of ancestors as part of the church's liturgical life. During the rites controversy, the position of the Vatican went back and forth a few times between tolerance and intolerance. The phrase merely civil and political, cited by Phan, by the way, was a phrase by a Jesuit missionary, Martino Martini, in his petition to Vatican, pleading the authorities to tolerate the practice of ancestral rituals in China. But eventually in 1742, the Vatican issued Ex Quo Sigillari, which forbade Chinese Catholics to participate in any rites in honor of ancestors and Confucius, and forbade anyone in the church to continue to discuss this issue. This edict was later reversed in 1939 by the Propaganda Fide, which affirmed that ancestral ceremonies, quote, retain merely the civil significance of piety toward ancestors, end quote. The apostolic letter in 1742 for Phan is a prime example of the church failing to listen to indigenous Chinese voices. But what did the Chinese Catholics actually say with regard to the ancestors and ancestral rites? What kind of role should the ancestors play in the lives of Chinese Catholics? I'd like to draw your attention to the writings of Yanmo, one of the most prolific Chinese writers during the Chinese rites controversy. We do not know much about his life, except that he grew up in the Fujian province, where his father was baptized by the famous Jesuit missionary Giulio Alani. But later, his parish was taken over by Dominicans, so he was familiar with the arguments on both sides. Although Yan did not directly address the question whether ancestors should be venerated as saints, he wrote extensively about whether ancestors should be venerated and how they should be venerated by Catholics. And his perspectives could shed some light on today's discussion about the status of ancestral veneration. In modern scholarship, the Chinese rites controversy is usually described as a debate between Jesuit and Dominican missionaries. When Matteo Ricci started his missionary work in China, he studied the Chinese language and culture and tried to accommodate many Chinese customs, including ancestral rites, which he deemed as non-superstitious. So here's a picture of Ricci. You can see him wearing this costume only for Confucian literati. And on the right is a picture of me. It's quite embarrassing, but I wanted to show that the hat actually made by the Jesuits. It became more sophisticated later. This is a real hat, by the way, not a replica, so I'm quite proud. So the Jesuits just took this kind of a policy of cultural accommodation, try to imitate the Chinese style of life in all ways. So Ricci famously asserts that the Chinese perform ancestral rites merely to show respect to their deceased elders. This set the tone for Jesuit missionaries later, who, with a few exceptions, largely followed his strategy of cultural accommodation and his attitude toward ancestral rituals. When Franciscan and Dominican missionaries also arrived in China, they challenged the Jesuit tolerance of ancestral rites among Chinese Catholics. The Mendicant missionaries maintained that ancestral rites should be condemned as idolatry on the ground that Chinese people believe in the presence of deceased ancestors at ancestral ceremonies, and that they koto and offer food to their ancestors in order to obtain supernatural protection and blessings. I do want to note that many Franciscan missionaries softened their positions on this issue. So the major opponents to the tolerance of Confucian rites were Dominicans and missionaries from the MEP priests. There was, however, a third party whose voices have largely been ignored by both church authorities at that time and scholars today, and that was the voice of Chinese Catholics. Yanmo was one of them. Generally speaking, the Chinese converts were in agreement with the Jesuits in believing that ancestral rites should not be deemed as idolatrous and thus should not be banned. However, whereas the Jesuits usually stop at defending the rites as civil and political, Chinese converts tended to go one step further by pointing out the positive value of practicing ancestral rites. In the late 17th century, Yanmo wrote 辩记, which means distinguishing sacrifices, in reply to the famous Dominican sinologist Francisco Varro's 辩记, which means debating sacrifices. There is certainly a wordplay here. So Varro argues that 祭, translated as sacrifice, should be reserved for God alone, and therefore sacrifice to ancestors constitutes idolatry and should be condemned. In reply, Yanmo argues that there are many different types of sacrifices in the Chinese tradition. And in order to make a proper judgment about ancestral rites, sacrifices, one must make a distinction among different kinds of sacrifices. So the Chinese emperor conducts an annual sacrifice to heaven, which in Yan's view is analogous to the holy sacrament of Eucharist and should be reserved for God alone. The sacrifice to ancestors, however, is a different kind of sacrifice and carries no religious meanings. Yan observes that the anti-rite missionaries condemn ancestral rites as idolatrous solely or primarily based on their observation of the outer form of the rites, such as burning incense, koto, and burning paper money. But whether the rites are idolatrous or not should depend on the inner meaning of those who perform these rites. Yan is also willing to admit that some people do pray to ancestors for supernatural blessings. However, this is not what the intention of the Confucian sages who established the rites. In other words, the people who pray for supernatural protection have gone astray from the normative meaning of ancestral rites, which according to Yan should be determined by what is said by the sages in Confucian canons, especially the Book of Rites and the Analects. An analogy of this would be like, although many Catholics would say they worship Mary, but it's not the position of the Catholic Church, and therefore the fact that people do worship Mary does not determine the nature of veneration of Mary in the Catholic Church. So Yan points out that the Confucian canons never claim that one should perform ancestral rituals to obtain favors. Instead, the doctrine of the Ming explicitly says that at ancestral rituals, one ought not to serve deceased as if, one ought to serve the deceased as if they were alive. And this is utmost filial piety. The Analects says one ought to make sacrifice as if the elders were present. Yan stresses that the as if phrase in the as if they were present shows that the sages believe that the ancestors are in actuality not present in ancestral ceremonies. According to this reading, the ancestral rites is a symbolic meal through which one expresses respect and gratitude to their elders who are deceased. Just like when the elders were alive, people invite the elders to a meal. They burn incense to make the room smell good, serve delicate dishes, and offer a monetary gift to the elders to make their trip back home more comfortable. After the elders pass away, their descendants do not want to forget them. They commemorate the deceased elders with a symbolic meal in imitation of the real meal. The descendants burn incense, serve dishes, and burn paper money. Thus, the underpinning pathos of ancestral sacrifice is filial piety. Just like when the elders were alive, one serves them a meal to express filial piety. After the elders pass away, the descendants serve them a symbolic meal to continue their filial piety. So Yan calls this form of filial piety, as in ancestral files, the 继孝, continued filial piety. Yan emphasizes that it's important not to ask deceased elders for blessings. Otherwise, the meal is no longer an expression of filial piety, but becomes bribery. This is why Yan believes the Book of Rites explicitly stipulates one ought not to pray for blessings during ancestral ceremonies. In brief, Yanmo is in agreement with the Jesuits and maintains that ancestral rites should not be banned on the ground that they are not they are, or at least should be, practiced as non-religious civil rites, which should be separated from liturgies conducted in the church. Another reason that Gimello gives for not confusing ancestral rites with church liturgies is that ancestral rites are usually practiced by private citizens at home in a Chinese society. Yan points out that a different kind of sacrifice, the annual sacrifice made to heaven by the emperor, is analogous to the liturgy in the church because there is a public dimension to it. In contrast, ancestral sacrifices are only made in the family, with the exception that some prominent ancestors might be celebrated in the clan or the lineage of people with the same surname. Confucius famously says, to celebrate remembrance ceremonies for an unrelated ghost, which at Confucius' time just means deceased person, is obsequious. So the veneration of the ancestors has been kept strictly in the family in the Chinese tradition. Modern scholars agree with Gimello on this point. In addition, they observe that the Chinese ancestral sacrifices have exclusively or primarily focused on male ancestors, because male ancestors were the ones that carried down a bloodline by passing down their family names. Venerating ancestors is thus a way of strengthening the identity of a family or a clan based on the same surname. The family and clan-based ancestral veneration differs from the veneration of saints in the Catholic tradition, whereas saints could be revered by all Catholics in the universal church. Ancestors are only the ancestors of a particular family of their own descendants. It is against the cultural sensitivity of the Chinese to venerate other families' ancestors. For the two reasons given above, that Confucian ancestral rites are non-religious rituals, and that they're only performed in private families or clans, Gimello believes that the ancestral rites should be kept distinct from liturgical life of the church. Yan does not offer much contemplation about whether the ancestors should be revered as saints, but it is safe to say that from his perspective, ancestors are radically different from saints, because in his writings, the only person he has identified as analogous to saints is Confucius. Confucius is Sheng Ren, the sacred person, and Professor Gimello has just explained the meaning of sacredness, so I'm just gonna pass here. And Confucius was a moral exemplar for all Chinese people. And for Gimello, it's not even clear that ancestors are in heaven, not to say they should be ranked as saints. But this is not in any way demeaning the ancestral rites. One could say there is something uniquely beautiful to it, for even if the ancestors were sinners, they still begot and raised their descendants, and their descendants rightly owed them filial piety. Gimello is unequivocal that ancestral rites should be permitted among Chinese Catholics. Does ancestral veneration play any active role in the lives of Chinese Catholics? Yan's answer is yes. Yan's overriding concern is that if Catholics do not participate in ancestral rites, people who are not Catholics would say, Catholics do not recognize their elders. This is a grave offense to the Tao. They're not human. Yan would concede that this criticism has a point, because in his view, human beings differ from animals in that animals do not venerate their elders and human beings do. What is more, once the elders die, the erection of name tablets and ancestral ceremonies comfort the heart of their descendants and make them feel as if the elders were still present in the family. Citing Xueying, a famous Confucian in the Han Dynasty, Yan points out that the descendants erect wooden tablets because they do not want to forget the deceased elders, so they rest their hearts on the wooden tablets. What is more important, Yan believes that the function of the ancestral rites is to help people cultivate the virtue of filial piety. In Yan's view, this is the deepest meaning and transforming power of ancestral rites. And if the descendants could expand the filial piety they have toward their own elders to revere God, they would be more loyal and grateful for what God has done for them. God, who is the creator and savior, is the prime parent in the Chinese mind. So this word, the prime parent, 大父母, this is quite unique because usually we call God the father, but actually in Chinese, like the Chinese Catholics, from very early on had called God like the great father and mother. So the virtue of filial piety toward deceased elders helps one become a better Christian, from Yan's perspective. In conclusion, in the view of Yanmo, ancestral veneration in the Chinese tradition should be clearly distinguished from the veneration of saints in the Catholic Church. In Yan's view, ancestral rites should nevertheless be permitted, even encouraged among Chinese Catholics, because it helps them cultivate filial piety, which when expanded can help Christians become more faithful toward God, the prime parent of all human beings. Actually, Phan acknowledges that Yan's understanding of ancestral rites was shared by many prominent Christians in the Chinese tradition. However, Phan maintains that the Confucians who held this understanding are, quote, mostly rationalistic and atheistic literati, end quote, whom the Jesuits worked with. The common people whom the Dominicans worked with, according to Phan, viewed ancestral rites as a religious cult. Perhaps because of the success of Rites' ministry among Chinese intellectuals in the 16th century, Jesuits were known for targeting the educated class. But in fact, as Nicholas Standard and many other scholars have pointed out, most of the people Jesuits had converted in the 17th and 18th century in China were paupers. They were common, simple, and illiterate people with little property. In fact, even Yanmo himself was merely a gongsheng, which is roughly equivalent to the present-day bachelor's degree at the very most. To call this crowd rationalistic and atheistic literati is grossly inaccurate. In 1702, Jesuit missionaries collected 60 letters and about 430 signatories from Chinese Christians of more than 5 parishes. The vast majority of these people were common people. In these letters, the Chinese Christians gave testimonies defending their practice of ancestral rites on the ground that ancestral rites are free from supernatural elements. This evidence shows that Yan's understanding of ancestral rites as non-religious rites were not only convenient for theologians and liturgists, but also proved to be widely acceptable by common Chinese Catholics. And this is it.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang.
Thank you.
Thank you. Might there be some questions for our speaker? Diane.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for a very fascinating paper. And I appreciate that the prime focus of your paper is more on the ancestors in relation to the communion of the saints. But as I listen, and you noticed at the outset some of the correspondences between the situation in Asia or in China with that of Africa. And so my question is, what I've seen among African theologians is this move toward, so this is more a question about Christology, but many African theologians are promoting Jesus as, if you like, a step above the ancestor, and they will distinguish Jesus from the human ancestors as the greatest ancestor or proto-ancestor or equivalent to distinguish Jesus. But I noticed that you made room for God as the prime parent with implications for theology. But I'm just interested to know, is there any move towards hailing Jesus as ancestor? And you know, you pointed out, as with the African situation, that the ancestors are often only for a particular family or clan, but one of the benefits of promoting Jesus as ancestor is that they emphasize this is over all of humanity, not the single clan. So I'm just wondering, I've wondered over the years why there might not have been more explorations of Jesus's ancestor in what I've seen of Asian theologies, Christologies.
Oh, thank you so much for this question, Professor Stinton. So actually, I believe, I mean, I should look into this more, but as far as I know, there's not a prominent theme identifying Jesus as a prime parent. And actually, when Matteo Ricci and the earliest Christian mission, you know, the Catholic missionaries went to China, barely anything was said about Jesus. So the message that God as the creator is the, you know, the prime parent is, I guess, resonates very strongly with the Chinese, you know, like mindset of filial piety. But on the other hand, like Jesus, actually the attackers of Christianity has picked out on that a lot. Like the missionaries did deliver the message gradually. But the attackers have said, well, Jesus was actually a rebel and he disrespected his parents, so he should not be revered as this kind of even godly figure. So that just shows that Christians who worship Jesus were not good people. So from my understanding, Jesus and the incarnation was some message that's very difficult for at least at the beginning for Chinese Christians to accept. So that was only came like until maybe roughly 1 or 2 centuries later.
Okay, thank you. And I do acknowledge that that was somewhat tangential to your focus, but I appreciate you handling the question. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Is there a way, oh, sorry.
Who asked that? Benjamin.
Ben, yeah. I was just wondering if, I really appreciated your talk and also the talk on African ancestors earlier in the series. And I'm wondering if there's a way you think that actually in the West and parts of the world where maybe we don't have a practice of veneration for those who have gone before, we could, as Christians, even learn from such practices that have been adopted by brothers and sisters in areas that have a rich sort of history of venerating the ancestors, not as saints, but in gratitude, as a way to foster our human reverence for others and ultimately for God. Is there a way that this can be practiced or maybe just somehow learned from in the West and in other parts of the world?
Well, I don't see why not. So, but I mean, this message is especially strong in Asia because the need for filial piety is just so ingrained in the Chinese mind. So if you are not filial toward your parents, it becomes a very big social stigma for others. Actually, as it did happen, when the church did eventually in 1742 banned the sacrifices, and Yanmo's concerns actually came true in China. People just stopped converting to Catholicism. So whether, there is a way, where is the possibility for people in the West to learn? I would say yes, but it's not as pressing as, for the Catholics in the East. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Gabriel had his hand up.
I'll ask really briefly. Thank you so much, Xueying, for a beautiful presentation. I was just concerned with the question of the virtue of the ancestors. You alluded to Yanmo acknowledging that even if they were not fully virtuous, that they still should be thanked. But it struck me that especially the idea of integrating them into the communion of saints, doesn't that involve discernment about at least a virtue? I don't know. So if you have any comments on that, thank you.
Oh, maybe I didn't make it quite clear, but so actually I wanted to agree with Yanmo here in making the clear distinction between ancestral veneration and the veneration of saints in the Catholic Church. The saints have to be some kind of moral, have to be more exemplars, but ancestors do not have to be. That's why the two need to be separated in people's lives. And I think that's also the view that Yanmo expressed. So in China, if one is, has it has not lived a moral life, it's possible to be kicked out of the family ancestry. For instance, if one commits adultery with a family member, so that's almost a set case to be excluded from the family ancestry, and that's considered a very severe penalty. But on the other hand, the standard is quite a bit lower than to become a saint in the Catholic sense. So the two should be clearly distinguished.
Thank you. Professor Gimello. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Peter Phan seemed to suggest that it's incumbent upon the church in Christianity to accommodate ancestor worship rather than to consign it to the realm of the purely civil observance. But as is often the case, Buddhism throws a monkey wrench into our conception of religiosity in China. When Buddhism came to China, it was in conflict with Chinese notions of filial piety. And if you become a monk or a nun in Buddhism, you in a sense, exempt yourself from the requirement to venerate the ancestors. And concern with the ancestors in the Chinese Buddhist tradition can't be characterized as veneration, but as the transfer of merit on their behalf on Buddhist premises. So I wonder if the case of Buddhism in China offers a method alternative to the one Peter Phan suggests for relationship between Christianity and the native Chinese traditions. The Buddhist tradition fundamentally altered the nature of the relationship between children and their ancestors, rather than accommodating the Chinese tradition in that regard. So, general question. Right?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point with regard to Buddhism. Buddhism was later. I mean, not sure if this is answering your question, but Christianity, like Matteo Ricci, basically condemned Buddhism, like the saying, you know, Buddhism. There were a lot of debate, a lot of like bad blood, you know, like bad attacks thrown back and forth between Catholics and you know, the Chinese Catholics and European missionaries, etc., about how Buddhism, how bad it is. But on the other hand, I think Catholicism did learn something from Buddhism, which is the priesthood. Priesthood was a very difficult concept to explain to the Chinese people, because, you know, if you truly love your parents, how can these Europeans just leave behind their parents and come here and live a celibate life? So I think in that regard, the Chinese Catholicism did, to some extent, borrowed the Buddhist concept, like analogously, saying, well, they honored their parents in a different way, which is to, you know, to serve God, the prime parent, and that itself is a merit toward their parents. So not sure if I have, you know, answered your question, but it's just.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Xueying Wang, and we're really grateful for your paper. And again, feel free to contact Professor Wang at luc.edu if you have questions or comments about her paper. I think we need to move to our third speaker today. We are blessed to have with us Professor Zhang from currently East China Normal University in Shanghai, China, where he is in the Department of History. We first encountered each other when he was in Rome, serving as a postulator in the Vatican's office that advanced the causes of saints and investigated the causes of saints. He's a scholar of the rites controversy as well, and wrote a dissertation about one of the major figures who led to its resolution in the 18th century, Cardinal Tournon. And we're really glad to have him here. His paper is entitled Mandarin or Christian, Wang Zheng, A Story of Conversion in the Ming Dynasty, 1571 to 1644. Welcome, Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for inviting me to this teleconference. So today, can you hear me, right?
Yep.
Oh, that's great. So today I'm going to present the story of Wang Zheng, a Mandarin and a Christian scholar born during the Ming Dynasty. So the Christian missionaries who arrived primarily from Europe brought with them different visions of meaning of life, social order, culture, community, death, and hereafter, the resurrection, we might say. The consequences of these alternative systems of thought, belief, and action set the stage for potential conflicts with existing polyvalent system operative in Chinese imperial society. As early Catholic missionaries would come to discover, and with great difficulty, we might say, sometimes appreciate, Chinese society was very complex, possessing a rich set of philosophical, spiritual, and practical elements, as was the case in other parts of the world, where the Catholic Church found itself torn between fidelity and two theological doctrines presented in culturally conditioned forms and rituals. So too was the case in the church's dealing with China. So from the childhood of our Mandarin Wang Zheng, he embraced the virtue of filial piety, which Professor Wang just said now, and brotherly affection, loyalty, reciprocity for the promotion of humanity. Some scholars would argue that he transmitted a line of thought and action consistent with those who are called wise ones or even saints. So in the 13th year, oh, I'm sorry, probably I should share my screen if it works. I'm sorry. Uh-oh. Paul, probably it's better if you can do it for me.
I will.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot it.
No problem.
So, yeah, next one. Okay. So in the 13th year of Emperor Wan Li, which is 1886, Wang married the niece of his aunt Shang at the young age of 15. As a child, he was taught by his uncle Zhang Jian, and just click the screen. Well, okay, great. He was taught by his uncle Zhang Jian, a famous Confucian scholar. One of Jian's theories proposed that the key to Confucian doctrine is to be honest with yourself. The path to saintliness is that when you think about your past, there are no regrets for what you have done before. So under the influence of Confucianism, many people in China had a long history of holding in reverence and admiration for someone who possessed special, we might say also saintly qualities. It will appear that the concept of revered person, saints, was omnipresent and exercised a powerful role in daily life, whether from the perspective of philosophy, history, rituals, or customs. So if we look at the Chinese word for saint, yes, that's true. Shen, yes, it is. The first letter of this character is Er, which means ear. And, oh, just next click. Yeah, Er, which means ear or to listen. According to the first, oh, no, it was. According to the first Chinese dictionary compiled by Xueying in 121, Origin of Chinese Characters, the main quality of a revered person, a saint, is his or her ability to listen to or to hear Shen's will, promise, and revelation. In this context, Shen refers to a supernatural or transcendental figure, a spirit or an essence present in all things. By extension, it could be understood as deity or even God. In the Tang Dynasty, Lu Deming, a Confucian classic scholar, believed that the Chinese character Shen, signifying saint, can actually be interchanged with the verb ting, to hear. So next, yeah. The same word resounds also in the Judeo-Christian scripture traditions. Hear, O Israel, the Lord of our God, the Lord is one. Or those who hear the word of God and act on it. Yes. Or we will see, we will do and listen. It will appear that the act of listening and of acting on what one has learned are consistent with the concept of a wise person, a saint, in the context of both Confucianism and also Christianity. Through careful attention is required in order to respect differences and recognize nuances in meaning. So, according to a Confucian understanding of the wise one or saint, the possession of a special auditory ability to listen is insufficient in and of itself. A second quality is required. A saint must also demonstrate extraordinary wisdom. The ancient book Shangshu Hongfan, composed around 1124 before Christ, states that those who can listen are astute, those who are wise are true saints. This wisdom, which is conferred upon wise people, saints, enables them to possess special insight into the meaning of past events, while at the same time being able to predict the future. a noted Confucian scholar, Xueying, a rationalist, greatly extolled the wisdom and ability of the saints. He believed that they are able to understand the Tao. So this belief in a special connection between the saint and the Tao has had a significant impact on Chinese thought. Tao is perceived as the basic law governing the universe. Some Confucian scholars believe that only saints can comprehend the Tao and then follow it. Furthermore, other Confucian experts argue that the Tao is the saint without a physical body, and the saint is the Tao with the body. Understood in this way, only saints can be unified with Tao, thus becoming one in mind and spirit. For this reason, saints are considered to be the wisest person in the world. So in Imperial China, the first step to become recognized as a sage or wise person involved, I may say in most cases, the passing of the imperial examination. Those who succeeded were awarded the title of Jingshi, so you can see in the screen, and all-imperial scholar. The Jingshi degree, which was created after the institutionalization of the civil service exam, first appeared during the Han Dynasty, around 200 before Christ. In the Ming Dynasty, it became the rule that only Jingshi holders could enter the elite group of scholars in Han Academy. So Wang unsuccessfully participated in the imperial examination in Beijing on more than one occasion. In 1614, he has received a book written by the Spanish Jesuit missionary, priest, and the companion of Father Medici, Father Diego de Pantoja. The book entitled Qike proposed a way for overcoming the 7 deadly sins. One was deeply touched by the arguments presented by de Pantoja, which he studied with great interest. He embraced the thinking of de Pantoja, and 2 years later requested to be baptized Catholic. So 6 years later, in 1722, at the age of 52, Wang successfully passed the imperial exam, thus becoming a Jingshi holder. This occurred during the reign of Emperor Tianqi, and Wang interpreted this success to his conversion to Christianity and to a special grace he believed he had received from the Lord Jesus Christ. Citing a biblical text from the book of Deuteronomy, he swore that he would never again consciously disobey the commandments of God. So in the book of Rites, the Master Confucius speaks about a third important quality that saints should possess, that of creativity. According to Confucius, a saint is a creator of the law, rites, music, instruments, and all necessities of a society. The spirit of creativity was found, for example, in the Yellow Emperor, who was recognized as a creative designer of houses, clothes, vehicles, boats, and utensils. And his minister, Tangling, was recognized for having invented the Chinese characters, which remain in use to the present. And Han Yu, promoter of Neo-Confucianism, argued in his book, The Original Tao, that the ancient saints taught people how to live together and how to prepare food, making clothing, build palaces, create medicine, devise rituals, write music, and so on. So the link between being a saint and possessing a creative capacity expressed itself in the life of the Christian convert Wang. He was noted for his scientific ingenuity as the inventor of a number of mechanical devices. Early in his life, he found himself deeply attracted to the European sciences and technology introduced by the Catholic missionaries in China. In 1627, he published a book, which we can see on the screen, Diagrams and Explanations of the Wonderful Machines of the Far West. It was the first encyclopedia of Western mechanical devices specifically addressed to Chinese audience. During his different tenures as an imperial official in the provinces, he introduced a new technology, including the use of cranes, mills. So probably you can change also. There are different photos here. And drainages, systems, and a wide range of other new inventions. From the perspective of Confucianism, one might be considered a good Mandarin official and a qualified scholar, a creative inventor and a wise man. Among Chinese Christians, he would have been presented an exemplary convert as he refused to follow the general law of Ming Dynasty. This law required that one take a woman in concubine. According to the tradition, a Jing title holder had to do so in order to be considered worthy of his new social status. The fact that he and a wife were unable to have a male offspring further complicated his situation, since high-ranking families in the imperial court were required to bear at least one male heir. So Wang struggled interiorly for a long time, refusing to take a woman in concubinage because of his understanding of the demands of Christian faith and morality. His official wife, brothers, nephews, and even his father put pressure on him to take a woman concubine. He found himself torn between two competing belief systems, each of which made serious demands of him. According to Confucian tradition and morality, he was required to produce a male offspring, a legitimate heir, who could guarantee the lineage of his family. Thus, to take a woman and would allow him to fulfill these requirements. On the other hand, however, the Christian commandments prohibit him from committing adultery by cohabiting with a second woman. In the end, he succumbed to the pressure and satisfied the demands of the imperial court. However, he struggled with an irresolvable inner conflict, how to participate fully in the life of his culture and system of beliefs, while at the same time faithfully fulfill the demands of Christian faith. So this account of Wang Zheng, which I tried to briefly describe in this teleconference, might not serve as a perfect story of a traditional Christian saint who offered their life in an ultimate act of martyrdom, nor does the life of Wang Zheng perhaps fit neatly into the categories of fama sanctatis and consequently fama signorum. However, I do believe his life reflects qualities attributed to those persons who struggle to live a life granted in a practical holiness, involving the pursuit of a simple, happy life, surrounded by family, children, a successful career, all of which are guided by deeply human and spiritual values. Wang's life reveals the struggle he faced as he responded in an authentically Chinese and authentic Christian manner to competing demands arising from his full participation in the social, cultural, economic, philosophical, and religious life of Imperial China, and in the pursuit of his Christian vocation. So European missionaries and Chinese converts made heroic efforts and sacrifices in order to adapt Christianity to Confucianism and more generally to Chinese society and vice versa. In reality, new converts to Christianity in China often found themselves in deep conflict with social and cultural values and practices. In many cases, the cultural differences between West and East, European and Chinese, Christian and Confucian, which were further complicated by false biased perceptions and conceptions about the other, led to open hostilities and conflicts. These debates between missionaries and converts, European and Chinese, Christians and non-Christians, caused much confusion regarding the possibility for the development within Christianity of a specific Chinese-style Catholicism. This situation has persisted for over 200 years, as we just mentioned the controversy. And the church has continued to struggle with its understanding of the nature of the revelation and the role of cultures and the process of inculturation as means for enabling Christians to find new and more vibrant ways to live their Christian faith and at the same time fully participate in their specific culture and among their own people and country. This struggle continues things within Christianity. The event of incarnation necessarily involves entering fully into the worldview and social practice of the people among whom gospel is presented, where the church is planted and grows. The challenges that Jing's title holders and convert to the church experienced remain much the same today. In the dialogue between Confucianism and Christianity, might be possible to uncover other areas of convergence of conceptions and practices, which, although not identical, reflect the commonalities that could, in the end, prove mutually enriching. This is a question. In conclusion, I call your attention to a profound reflection on holiness and saints by former Bishop of Rome, Benedict XVI, during a Mass in 2011 in Germany. So Benedict said, the sermon and this opportunity the saints act on, they recognized the living God. They saw him, they listened to him, as Tao said, to hear Shen's will and revelation. And they went towards him, they traveled with him, they so to speak, caught his contagious presence. They reached out to him in the ongoing dialogue of prayer, and in return, they received from him the light that shows where true life is to be found. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Any questions or comments for our speaker? Thank you so much. I have one.
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Someone like the figure you are highlighting, you've concentrated on the tensions he felt to bear a male heir.
Yeah.
And thus to commit what for Christians was adultery, but in Chinese tradition for someone of his elite status was a requirement of his filial duty.
Yes.
The previous talk talked about the tensions within a particular act of devotion that so many Chinese Catholics would have been tempted to undertake, and they would have received different messages from the missionaries and others around them. Reverence for ancestors. It strikes me that both of them are linked to this idea of your personal and communal and family continuity through time.
Yeah.
Both points of tension are this notion of how you, as an individual person, have a life through time in your understanding of your identity and your destiny.
Yeah.
Is that seem right to you? And do you think Chinese Christians today, or Catholics today, have figured out how to negotiate that well?
Well, I think China is so big. It's a continent. So it all depends where you're from. Just as Professor Wang mentioned just right now, I was thinking about, because some Christians from South, they actually think in another way, which is different from those from North. So I mean, it all depends also which kind of education you received in your lifetime. So if you come from the countryside, probably people think in a different way as those who live in a big city. So this is a situation that they have to face. I do remember in the history, and for example, during the Chinese rights controversy, and the Bishop Charles Maigret, who was from the MAP, from Mission Étrangère de Paris, and he used to live in Fujian. in the south part of China. So when the Emperor Kangxi called him to the north, to Beijing, to the court, and the Emperor asked him, "Do you understand my words? Do you understand the Chinese characters? Do you understand the Chinese culture?" Oh, well, actually, the Chinese culture, which he understood, was a culture from the south, and he spoke the local language. Of course, he didn't speak Mandarin, or he didn't speak very well Mandarin. So it all depends on the context, the social and cultural context where you're from. Because if you think about China is so big. So we are all different from north, east, always. So it is a question, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Gabriel.
Yeah, please, Gabriel.
Thank you, Ray, for that beautiful talk and the wonderful images on the PowerPoint, like the others who presented before you. I wonder if you had thoughts on the first two presentations and could put your presentation in conversation with some of the themes. Obviously, the first one was on Buddhism, so maybe that's more challenging. But some of the things that Professor Wang brought up in regard to questions of devotion to ancestors, and the relation between culture and faith, the enculturation of religion in Wang Zheng, I'm not sure I'm getting his name correct, in his experience. So yeah, could you comment a bit on how your insights relate to those two papers?
Yeah, actually, I was inspired by the paper of Professor Wang and also by Professor Ro, because a cross-cultural category is quite important in our history and the cultural context. For example, Wang at the end of his life, he constructed a pagoda, and in the center of the pagoda there was a cross in the center, but nearby the cross there were how to say, his ancestors' names. He put also the tablet of ancestral names in the same pagoda, in the same church, we might say, and so it was quite special. And also, you know, at in his old age, he retired from the court, and he went back to his hometown, where he purchased a hillside plot of land, upon which he built also a monastery. So he embraced the life of a hermit, and seeking for forgiveness for having accepted a second wife. So according to the demands of the imperial court and the Confucianism. So a direct violation of his Christian faith for his opinion. And I found that there is a diary, in his diary entitled 崇一堂日记随笔. So in this diary, Wang explained the motive for his late embrace of the life of a hermit. So he speaks about the meeting with a Jesuit missionary whose name was Adam Wong Shaw, and for a few years earlier in Xi'an, in the center of China. And this missionary shared with him stories of European saints who had chosen to embrace a monastic lifestyle in order to devote themselves to prayer and the contemplation of Lord Jesus. So in his appropriation of Catholic faith, Wang expressed his personal attraction to a spiritual minority, and the Christian belief that those who are the least would become the first in the kingdom of God. So this conception was quite weird for him, because in the traditional philosophy of Confucianism, which promoted a culture in which a person was encouraged to work hard, striving to become the first and the best, so as to obtain status and privilege. So there are a lot of this kind of conflicts between two kind of systems. So in his life, yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Odazor.
Hello, sorry, I just want to make a general statement that about a lot of the things that have been said here. Just quick one because we're running out of time. It occurs to me that sometimes when we talk about ancestor worship, we forget that the greatest ancestor worshippers are Christians. The whole cult of saints is, as the letter to the Hebrews would say, a cloud of witnesses that Christians call on. But the difference is that they redefine this whole thing by going through Jesus Christ, not by ethnicity anymore, or by geography or whatever. That Christians, every day when I say the prayer, I call on Mary. We say Hail Mary. We call on the saints at Mass every day. We do that. So I think we must not forget. Sometimes we make it something esoteric out there, primal religions, people there. But Christians, at least Catholicism, is a hugely ancestral, has a hugely ancestral place. But at the head of that ancestor, or the reason for that ancestorship, is Jesus Christ, and so on. And I just wanted to make this because that would inform a lot of the things I think we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Professor Odozor. Any final remarks? Well, I just want to thank once again our speakers, Professors Gimello, Wang, and Zhang. And thank you all for joining. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next Friday, same time, same station, and for 3 more great papers. So thank you all very much. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.